I'm Mark Golub. And all the turmoil and controversy over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's address to a joint session of Congress is finally coming to an end. Tuesday, he will speak to the world via the platform of the United States Congress. But this issue remained ugly and bitter to the very end, punctuated by the administration's Secretary of State, John Kerry, testifying before a House committee about the questionable reliability of Mr. Netanyahu's geopolitical perspective. Mr. Kerry reminded the House committee that during the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, Mr. Netanyahu, who was not prime minister at the time, not only urged the United States to invade Iraq, but predicted that a U.S. assault on Saddam Hussein, leading to the dictator's downfall, would actually inspire a revolution in Iran that would bring down the Iranian leadership. Now, obviously, Mr. Netanyahu was wrong in that prediction. As Mr. Kerry suggested, Mr. Netanyahu could be wrong on his dire predictions of an impending bad deal with Iran and his prediction that a bad deal would open the door to Iran's obtaining a nuclear weapons threshold. This is not the only administration official to criticize Mr. Netanyahu of late. National Security Advisor Susan Rice went on national television to say that Mr. Netanyahu's acceptance of Speaker John Boehner's invitation is, quote, destructive, unquote, to U.S.-Israeli relations. Well, just how destructive is Mr. Netanyahu speaking to Congress to share his sense of the Iranian nuclear threat with the United States Congress and the world? And how have Washington Democrats and the congressional community as a whole reacted to this controversy? Well, for some insight, we're pleased to be joined on our phones once again from our nation's capital by the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Ron Kampeas. Ron, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us again.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so Ron, we're about to see the Prime Minister address Congress. As you look at the way this entire controversy and the quagmire, the flap unfolded, and then again culminating in the remarks of Secretary of State Kerry, what's your personal sense of how serious this breach that has been charged of the Israeli Prime Minister, how serious a breach do you see it?
I think it's fairly serious from the point of view of Democrats. I mean, what you've had until now, until this unfolded, was personal tensions between the two leaders, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. And Democrats were kind of caught in the middle. There were you would hear about, like, let's say, private meetings between Jewish lawmakers and the president, or private messages that Jewish lawmakers that were sending Netanyahu, just asking both guys to calm things down, to bring things down a notch. And what this has effectively done is it has pushed the Jewish Democrats, I think, into their president's camp. Instead of acting as brokers, they've felt marginalized and blindsided by Netanyahu. Because remember, so much has been focused on the fact that Netanyahu and his ambassador here, Ron Dermer, kept the planning of this speech at Boehner's request. They kept it a secret from the White House.
Yes.
But they also kept it a secret from Democrats. And that was especially humiliating for them in the sense that Boehner issued the invitation on behalf of both parties.
Yes.
And suddenly Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid wake up on a Tuesday morning or a Wednesday morning, and they find out that they're inviting Netanyahu, but nobody told them. And it's so that protocol has put them in an uncomfortable position. And it's been compounded by other things. I mean, there's been a growth in Republican support for Israel over recent years, but Democratic support has been stagnant, if not having receded a little. And what's perceived, among Democrats as a major diss of their president would make it difficult, I think, for Democrats to come out on the Prime Minister's side on this one. And at first, it was interesting. If you looked at the statements that were coming out of Democrats, the decrying of the speech, immediately after January 21st, when it was issued, the invitation, they were very specific in blaming Boehner, John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, for the controversy. They really went out of their way not to blame Netanyahu. They actually took it on faith, statements by people who were close to Netanyahu saying that they thought that Boehner was arranging everything. They didn't realize that he was freezing out Democrats. They took that on faith. And that was how it was. But as Netanyahu rejected their appeals for like another way, I just learned, for instance, that Nita Lowey, very pro-Israel, very important pro-Israel figure because she's the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, had privately appealed to Netanyahu, okay, come address both parties in Congress, do it behind closed doors. It's a good idea because this way, if you're really concerned about Iran deal, you can share classified information. And he turned that down. And so they say, like, they don't understand the stubbornness with which he is sticking to a position that puts them in a very, very uncomfortable position with their own constituents. And that is destructive in terms of the of what it could lead to. You know, it's part of a process. Like I said, there's been a discrepancy between Democrats and Republicans on being pro-Israel in any case, but this severely exacerbates that. And you know, until now, of course, we've had bipartisan support for Israel, and this, you know, could accelerate the process of making it more partisan.
Do you believe now that Prime Minister Netanyahu knew all along that John Boehner did not have Democratic congressional support for the invitation?
I don't know. I can't tell you. I really don't know. I know that Tzachi Hanegbi, the deputy foreign minister who's very close to Netanyahu, says that he didn't. I don't know that it's necessarily plausible. I know they haven't said. They have acknowledged that Dermer and Netanyahu, well, Dermer has acknowledged not informing the administration. He hasn't said whether he talked about it with Democrats in Congress. I know that Democrats in Congress, the most pro-Israel Democrats in Congress, were completely blindsided by this.
Okay.
And I know that they meet routinely with Dermer.
Okay. Now, are you saying that you believe there is a possibility that the bipartisan support Israel has enjoyed in Congress is in jeopardy because Boehner sends an invitation to Netanyahu, which Netanyahu accepts without clearing it first with the White House, that because of that, you believe that the bipartisan support Israel has enjoyed, overwhelming bipartisan support, even though, again, Democrats and Republicans do not see the issues confronting Israel the same way. But bottom line has been bipartisan support on funding, on military funding, on intelligence, on wanting the United States to take certain positions in the Security Council supportive of Israel. Are you suggesting, Ron, that you are now concerned that because of this, whatever you want to call it, misunderstanding or slight to the president, or somehow the position that Netanyahu has put some Democrats in, having to choose, you say, between Israel and their Democratic president, that there is a possibility in your mind that the bipartisan support Israel has enjoyed is in jeopardy?
I think the possibility has increased. You know, I think a lot of it depends on the degree to which Democrats see this as a Bibi problem or as an Israel problem. And I think that the tendency now is more to see it as a Bibi problem. You know, so it depends on whether Netanyahu is reelected on March the 17th, what he does after he's reelected as far as the relationship goes. But this whole thing has created serious bad blood between the party and Netanyahu. I said at the beginning, Democrats tended to blame Boehner more. In recent statements, they are blaming Netanyahu directly. And I'm not talking simply about the leftist Democrats. I'm talking about more mainstream ones.
Like whom? Like whom?
Like the administration, like John Kerry, who is considered to be...
No, I want a congressional name.
Jan Schakowsky, and you had the letter from let's say a couple of weeks ago, Nita Lowey and Steve Israel wrote a letter to John Boehner saying, fix this. The other day, Dianne Feinstein and Dick Durbin from Illinois wrote a letter to Netanyahu saying, fix this, by coming to meet with us, and he turned them down. Now, Dianne Feinstein, was historically pro-Israel. In recent years, she's become a little more critical. Dick Durbin is a second-ranked Democrat in the Senate, the second most important Democrat in the Senate. He was elected to the House in the early 1980s with AIPAC support, and he's always appreciated that. Every time he's been at an AIPAC conference, he mentions that because there was, I forget who it was, but there was an anti-Israel incumbent in Illinois that they were trying to unseat. And now he is saying to Netanyahu, this is your problem, fix it. And I think that's significant because it's being said in public.
In part, I think to myself a couple of things. I'd love to hear your reaction. My experience in life is that an issue like this has a very short shelf life, that issues come and go in a moment, and that in a moment, Netanyahu will speak. He's probably going to be terrific. He's probably going to say wonderful things about President Obama and the relationship between Israel and Congress and Israel and the United States. And, either he will or will not become the next prime minister to create a coalition government in Israel. And it'll be April and May, and this will be ancient history. So one of the things that I feel is this has been enormously overblown in some way by all of us, because I can't blame the other media, Ron. I'm dealing with this day after day after day, because it seems to me that's what the Jewish community is talking about day after day after day. But, and I'm going to take them one at a time. My first question to you is, do you think I am right or wrong when I say to you, this is not a lasting issue that is going to have a terrible, dire consequence for the U.S.-Israeli relationship? It is a moment in time. There have been worse conflicts between presidents and prime ministers, and this will come and go, and people like Menendez and other very staunch pro-Israel Democrats, Nita Lowey and Feinstein, and Pelosi says she's going to be there to hear the president, the prime minister. She's not absenting herself as some Democrats are. It seems to me that this issue is not going to undermine in any way at all the traditional bipartisan support, and it will be ancient history faster than one can blink an eye. Do you think I'm wrong?
I don't think you're wrong. I think that's also a possibility. Yeah, you're right. We live in a very who knows what happened yesterday type of age, right? As people, there is an unprecedented element to this whole conflict that, if you want, I can go into. But, people have been reminding me online, and I don't even need reminding because I'm always reminding others. What about Reagan? What about Ford, Rabin? There's so many other tensions in the past. But we forget about them. Reagan is now, when I wrote his obituary in 2004, everybody was calling me to tell me how much they missed him. Jewish leaders were calling me to tell me how much they missed him. But yet he had terrible relationships with Menachem Begin. So these things, I think, the relationship is strong enough that it's withstood crises like this.
I think that's very, very well said. Then there's something else that bothers me. I want to know whether it bothers you or whether you think I'm overstating it. If there were to be any erosion in the Democratic Party of bipartisan support for the State of Israel, I believe that this particular event in time may only give cover to Democrats who are already backing away from the State of Israel. I don't expect Congress to be any less supportive in a bipartisan sense. But if there are Democrats who are going to distance themselves and they use this as a reason, I don't believe them. I believe that, as you said earlier in your analysis, there has been, I don't know if the word, Ron, is erosion, whether that is fair, but we all remember the Democratic National Convention and the issue of the plank on Jerusalem and the booing that was in the audience. And there is, I've talked to Israeli journalists who say to me that while there still is bipartisan support, the Democrats tend to add riders, amendments to bills which call upon Israel to do certain things on the West Bank with settlements, which Republicans don't normally add to as amendments to bills. So while a bill itself may be pro-Israel, there's something about the bill or the amendments, even if they don't get added to the bill, that represents a different perspective from within the Democratic Party. But my question for you specifically is, when I say to you, I believe that this is not the reason why any Democrat would pull away from Israel, that really it is cover for something else going on. I want to know the extent you think I'm right or wrong.
I think that, in some cases you're right. I think, let's say, if you look at somebody who's not attending, let's look at the people who aren't attending. There are the 30 people who are not attending that we know about. Let's say somebody like John Yarmouth, who happens to be Jewish from Kentucky, from Louisville, and he has been very critical of Israel recently, particularly during the Gaza war, and he's not attending. And so, this whole controversy sort of, he would say, reinforces his apprehensions about Netanyahu, at least. Perhaps not Israel, but Netanyahu.
Yes.
On the other hand, you have somebody like John Lewis, the civil rights hero.
Yes.
And he is not attending. And I've seen John Lewis. I remember seeing him at the convention in 2012 in a small forum that the American Jewish Committee organized. And Steve Cohen from Tennessee, who's Jewish, was being critical of Israel. And Lewis was correcting him, saying, basically Israel lives in a bad neighborhood. They're going to do certain things that anybody would do. Lewis is not an anti-Israel or Israel-critical or even Netanyahu-critical lawmaker, but Lewis is. He's an African-American lawmaker, and there is, I think, very great sensitivity in the Black Caucus, in the Congressional Black Caucus, about Obama being dissed. And so I think that kind of boycott of the speech is indicative of fault lines that are being dangerously gotten close to with this.
Very, very interesting. By the way, could it all change if Herzog is chosen to form the next coalition government?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Herzog's indicated, if you look at his ads on Israeli TV and his statements, he said that one of his priorities is repairing relations with the Obama administration.
It would be very. By the way, I don't know what you hear. I still hear the overwhelming probability is, again, we're weeks away, many things can happen, but that even if Herzog wins a few more seats in the Knesset than Likud wins, Netanyahu still will have a better chance of putting together a 61-member coalition than Herzog, and that the probability still is that Netanyahu will remain Israel's prime minister, and that means for the next, almost 2 years, there'll still be the Obama-Netanyahu, discord. I want you to speak, by the way, about the members of the administration, and I'd love our audience to hear your sense of it. When you heard Secretary of State Kerry's remarks, how'd you react?
It was interesting. I think that there is an impression, and it's not just in the administration. There's an interesting speech that Ron Dermer, before he was ambassador, when he was an aide to Netanyahu, just after Netanyahu was elected, that he gave at the AIPAC conference in 2009. And the speech, you can find it on YouTube. It's a 9-minute speech, and he says repeatedly that Netanyahu was right in this case. Netanyahu was right in that case. Netanyahu was right in this case. And anybody who's interacted with Netanyahu and with Dermer knows that is just a big part of how they present the case. Hey, we were right in the past when everybody thought we were wrong, and we turned out to be right. Let's say in Oslo, regarding Oslo and the failures of Oslo and other things. And that's a lot of what that's very much part of their tone now in defending the Iran thing. So when I heard Kerry and saying, he was wrong on Iraq, in some contexts it would be a gratuitous dig, but I do understand it in terms of facing people like Netanyahu and Dermer, whose part of their argument, I mean, part of their argument is the substance of what looks to be a bad deal with Iran. But part of it is also, hey, we've been right in the past and you ignored us. You should pay attention to us now. And I think being on the butt end of that kind of argument is irritating, okay. Especially if you've ever been a teenager. You know how aggravating that it can be to hear that.
Bo, that last comment was very profound
of
you.
Teenager.
We don't need a teenager as Secretary of State. Bowie, it's an interesting wrinkle. My own reaction was it was just unnecessary and sort of, I don't know, just snarky, and I wish he hadn't done it. What about the fact that Vice President Biden has made plans to be out of the country and therefore will not be sitting as president of the Senate during Netanyahu's remarks?
I think that was a signal from the administration that they're very unhappy with this speech. I mean, one could argue that maybe Biden was supposed to be out of the country, but significantly, when they said that he wouldn't be here, they weren't able to name a country that he was going to be in.
Ron, how do you feel American Jewish leadership in general has dealt with this issue?
They've been very careful, and I think they've been successful so far in navigating what's a very difficult thing for them. In one sense, I think Netanyahu made it easy for them because he kept them in the dark as well. And AIPAC was as blindsided by this speech as the Democrats were.
By the way, did you hear that from any AIPAC person that they felt blindsided?
I've heard that from the most senior officials at AIPAC, yes.
They felt blindsided. By the way, they have been very, very quiet on this issue, yes?
They've been quiet on this issue, and I think that's been a measure of their success. All they're doing is encouraging lawmakers to attend the speech. That's been their bottom line. And without going into the propriety of the speech. There was all this talk that one of the ways that the administration was going to penalize Netanyahu is by not sending somebody to AIPAC. And I said at the time, I put on social media, that would be a bad idea because this is not AIPAC's problem. AIPAC didn't instigate this, and why would you be punishing them? And, I don't think anybody was reading my Twitter feed, but evidently they came to the same conclusion. And I think it's just because AIPAC has been, really good about separating the message from let's listen to the speech because what he has to say about Iran is important without saying, and this organizing the speech in this particular way was a really good idea.
You know what? When I first heard about this myself, I was a little uncomfortable that somehow on a senior diplomatic level, this wasn't worked out behind the scenes and that it never should have gone public the way it went public. And I don't know who was responsible. I don't know whether the Netanyahu administration could have handled it better, whether Dermer in some way wasn't smart about how he went to Boehner, that he seemed to be part of this plan. Don't tell the White House, because if we tell the White House will somehow try to squash it. But in some way I was uncomfortable about the way it evolved. At the same time, it seems to me that it's very important for Benjamin Netanyahu, who has made this issue, the Iranian nuclear threat, his issue, I mean, from 2006 and beyond. I mean, it has been an obsession, a driving force, irrespective of whether he is the Prime Minister of Israel. He believes his Jewish state and the world is in serious peril and is in serious jeopardy if, in fact, Iran reaches the nuclear weapons threshold. And when he says, I would like to talk about this before P5+1, the United States makes a deal which I consider to be a bad deal with Iran, I want the opportunity to speak on perhaps the greatest platform in the world, a congressional bipartisan meeting. And I want the Prime Minister to do that, and I understand he feels that's his responsibility, if not an obligation. And I said to myself, I wish the White House, even if they were annoyed as hell that Netanyahu was going to come, and what really bothered them? They were upset that Netanyahu may make a very good case against the deal that the administration may want to push through, even without congressional bipartisan approval of that deal. But in any case, they were upset that Netanyahu was going to somehow rock their cart. And I said to myself, I wish my American administration would be bigger than that even if it bothered them, they would not make an issue about this. And I felt that in some broad way, the Prime Minister of Israel had every right to accept a congressional invitation, and that there's no way I can think of where Netanyahu would have said no or turned it down that would not have been worse for Israel, for Netanyahu, and maybe for the United States than all of the flap that's occurred because he said yes. So I'm disappointed in our administration, and I think that in essence, this was the lesser of any evil you could find. Netanyahu, in fact, saying yes and coming to speak to a joint session of Congress.
I wish that both sides were bigger. I really wish that, yes, that definitely that the administration hadn't, gone to the bunker on this one. But I wish that, Jeffrey Goldberg, the Atlantic journalist, says he's heard that, and I didn't believe this, he's heard that Netanyahu has written off the Obama administration. I didn't believe it until this happened. You don't enter for 2 weeks into secret talks with the opposition leader if you haven't written off the leader. And I think that's very difficult. So you just wish that everybody was a little more grown up. But I'd also take what you say it's true. I think that much of what's been driving the argument is the idea that he's doing this because of elections, perhaps in a way that he doesn't acknowledge to himself he is. But I think the bigger issue, the more preeminent issue, is the threat of Iran. And that's what I hear a lot. I hear people saying, but this message is so important.
Yes.
He has to get it out.
Yes.
He has to get it. And I see that. But here's what's happened. Because of this, how this has played out, since January, since for a month, we've been talking about bad blood, and we've been talking about a speech, and we haven't been talking about Iran.
Yes.
There was an op-ed the other day in the Washington Post. David Ignatius, who was a backer of the talks, had an interview with Yuval Steinitz, the intelligence minister, formerly the science minister in Israel. And Steinitz, in a very calm and deferential way, deferential to David Ignatius and his ideas, laid out the reasons why Israel is opposed to this deal as it's emerging, because we don't know what the deal is. And the most salient reason is the sunset clause.
Is what?
The sunset clause. That's the idea that after 10 years, Iran can start winding down all the restrictions, because that's taking a kind of crazy bet. The idea that somehow in 10 years either the Iranian regime will be gone or it will be so moderated that it won't matter anymore. And those, anything can happen. But that's like if I were to put a time frame on that, I'd make it more like 100 years and not 10 years. And he was utterly persuasive, Steinitz, because he didn't make the issue himself. He didn't make it He didn't make it about Obama. Mm-hmm. He made it about the deal. Mm-hmm. And at the end, it was interesting. At the end of the column, Ignatius said, "I'll write one more column on this, but I have to confess that after speaking with him, I did not know how to argue against his point," or something like that.
Very interesting.
Very interesting. And so you see, that's how you make the point.
Yes. Ron, it is always wonderful to talk to you. Thank you for giving us so much time. And we'll follow up on this after Tuesday's speech. I'll always be chasing you. But I thank you very much for participating on In the News here on JBS. Thank you, Ron.
No problem. Thank you.
Ron Kampeas, the Washington Bureau Chief of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Again, the issue soon will be history. My thanks to Sloan Copeland, Serge Goldberg, and the producer for this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.